Hello everybody, welcome back to the podcast. My name is John. I'm here with David and Mary. We're on Safeguarding Month, and to explain all that and what's going to be spoken about, let's go over to Mary.
Thanks for that, John. I'm Mary. I'm the Customer Insight Officer for SAHA. And looking forward to today's podcast. So over to you, David.
Thanks, Mary. Well, we're back from our break, and we're now into our next podcast. It's all to do with safeguarding. Well, today we've actually got a special guest, and I'll get the special guest to introduce themselves very shortly. Okay, so over to you, special guest.
Oh, thank you, David, for inviting me. It's Jane here from South West Surrey Refuge, one of the domestic abuse services SAHA run. So far away.
Lovely. Thanks, Jane. Nice to have you back on our podcast. As I said, today is safeguarding, and within that safeguarding, we're going to be looking at domestic abuse issues. First question for you then. Over the last year or so, particularly during the lockdown periods that we've had, it's been reported that domestic abuse incidents have actually increased. What can you tell us about that?
It's not a surprise, really, if you work in refuge or work supporting domestic abuse victims, because people, especially through the lockdowns, families, they haven't been able to go out to work. For victims already suffering domestic abuse, that's probably exacerbated the abuse. It's undoubtedly got worse for a lot of people, and quite possibly has started for a lot of other people as well, because, the pubs were closed. Nobody could do any social sort of external activities and things like that. And so a lot of pressure on everybody, undoubtedly through the lockdowns, but certainly with regards to domestic abuse.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks for that. One of the things that we were looking at, and I know we've talked about it before, as a lay person, I may not have any sort of experience in domestic abuse or domestic violence issues and that sort of thing. Are there any key indicators that people could perhaps look out for to think to themselves, is there something I need to do here? So what can you tell us about that?
The most obvious thing would be if neighbours hear a lot of arguments or somebody in distress, following arguments in a nearby property next door or over the road or something, certainly to call the police straight away, because it could be that a row has escalated out of control and somebody could be in serious danger. But domestic abuse, it's not only just physical. It might not be physical. It might be controlling. It's always controlling behaviour, but if somebody is very withdrawn, perhaps afraid to speak or reluctant to speak in front of their partner, that perhaps could be significant that they are experiencing some form of abuse.
Can I ask a question, Jane, about that? Listening to what you're saying, I was just thinking about if, as a member of the public, anybody, a resident, I observed this, I might be nervous about contacting an official department. Is there anywhere that I could get advice, kind of explaining my thoughts that I've seen a friend who's withdrawn and so on? Is there anywhere I can go for advice on that?
There are lots of helplines which they probably would be happy to advise you. Women's Aid, perhaps domestic abuse outreach service in a particular area that you lived in or somewhere like that. They could probably advise you on what to do.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I think, as we heard from Jill when, in a previous podcast, it can be difficult for people to report, and it's always good to know that, there's somewhere they can go for advice, as well as the person who's suffering violence or abuse, obviously.
In some cases, some victims are accompanied everywhere they go, to the shop, to the doctors, to the chemist, any appointments they have to attend. They will always be accompanied by their partner and or other family members. So it can be very, very difficult to reach out for help. So I think if everyone's aware that somebody might be being abused, in this way or in any way.
It's a crucial reason for having Safeguarding Month, isn't it? So that we can kind of highlight these things that you just don't
Definitely.
necessarily think about.
Hello, Jane. If I can just jump in there a moment. I know you've been talking about the domestic abuse regarding mainly around adults, but where do children come into this? Because obviously they're around and about, when a lot of this happens. How do they fit in?
Thank you for the question. In the domestic abuse bill that has come out this year, the new domestic abuse bill, children now who witness domestic abuse in any form are actually classed as victims also. And so we're hoping that's going to mean that children actually get a lot more support as well as women or men who go through domestic abuse. So, it affects children terribly. We know that, through the years that I've worked at the refuge, particularly some of the boys will imitate the behaviour from dad towards mum and lash out at her or talk to her in a derogatory way. So our family support worker and children's workers work really hard with the children and mums to improve the relations and how the relationship is between the child and mum.
Thank you for answering that. I was like, it can't be an easy task to sort out, but it's nice that some things are being put in place to cover all events. David, I'll go back to you.
Lovely, thanks, John. Jane, just one question. It's leading on a little bit more from something that Mary said earlier. When we talked about, how do we report domestic abuse incidents, etc., one of the questions from me is if people are sort of, reticent rather than just sort of going in and shutting their front door and ignoring it, do you think that they should actually get involved and report incidents?
It's very difficult because some people are too terrified to reach out and report anything or get help. If it's physical violence, a neighbour might hear something terrible going on, then obviously it's a 999 call straight away to the police. But if it's not that, it can be very, very difficult for a victim of domestic abuse to actually reach out for help because perpetrators make all sorts of threats to their lives, to the children's lives, to families' lives. And it's just terrifying. So I'm not too sure, how much people can get involved, if it's possible to talk to the victim when they're on their own, just to say, is everything all right? Do you need any help? It's tricky because some people will deny anything's going on and not want to engage with anything.
Yeah, sure, I understand that. Mary, pass something back to you, for example, if a Saha resident believes that something is happening in terms of domestic abuse or domestic violence to someone that they know nearby, if they phone Saha, would their call be treated in confidence? So, they have the confidence in themselves that they can actually report something that's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think quite likely we're going to be hearing in another episode from our newly formed safeguarding champions. So I suspect that anyone ringing up with concerns would probably be directed to one of the safeguarding champions. But most certainly everything they say will be treated with the utmost confidentiality. And if it was particularly about domestic abuse, then I think the customer service centre would undoubtedly even ring one of our domestic abuse services. So, Jane, what could I do if I was concerned about reporting a safeguarding issue? Can I get some advice from somewhere about doing that?
Yes, there's an organisation called Refuge and also Women's Aid that you probably heard of, and on their websites you can find quite a lot of information on what to do if you are worried about somebody or you have concerns, and also it's sometimes quite difficult for a woman to actually recognise that she is experiencing abuse, because over time the perpetrators will talk to her in such a way she actually believes that it's her that's at fault. They can be very critical and put the blame onto the victim. So with regards to, you know, actually talking to somebody that you're worried about it has, I would say it has to be quite a gently approach, because they may not want to discuss anything. They may be denying that there's actually anything going on that's abusive. They may, it's quite normal or common for a person to still be in love with their partner, but they don't like the violence or the abuse. So it can be very conflicting for them. And of course, there's also fear comes into it massively, because the perpetrator could have made threats or could be making threats. If the woman speaks out to anybody, they will harm her, harm the children, harm her family. So there's quite a lot of emotions that anyone experiencing abuse is going through, and it could make them reluctant to actually admit there's anything going on or reach out for help.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. It's very, of course, it's a very complicated situation. And I suppose, as you say, gently, but it's really good to know that you can get advice from, some other places.
Yeah, I mean, if you're concerned, it obviously all comes under safeguarding. But if you're worried that somebody's going to be really physically hurt badly, then I would say you need to contact, another agency to inform them of that.
Okay, Jane, you just mentioned when you're talking to Mary there about children, because they suffer abuse as well in these situations. What can you tell us about that? Yes,
children always suffer because of what they've witnessed. That in itself can affect them quite badly. With the new domestic abuse bill that's come out earlier this year, children who witness domestic abuse are now actually recognised as victims, and that's a really big thing for agencies like ourselves, because we are hoping that now children will be able to access a lot more support because of that. 1 in 5 children actually are affected by domestic abuse in some form or another. So we're hoping that it will prompt other agencies to get involved sooner where children are concerned, so that children are supported. Within the refuge, we do notice sometimes abusive behaviour that the children have kind of learnt from the perpetrator. So they will be physically lashing out at mum, or also talking to mum in a derogatory way. So that's where our children's worker and family support worker would do quite a lot of work with the children and mum to improve things greatly. If in the case of any Saha resident who is suffering from domestic abuse in any form, please do reach out either to Saha or to somebody, because there is help out there for victims of domestic abuse, and it doesn't have to carry on and on and on. It's possible to break away from it and have a happy, peaceful life.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Jane. Well, that's all from me, I think, for today. I'll pass it back to Mary and then to John in case they've got any questions for you. But I'd like to say thanks ever so much for your input today. It's been very worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, no more questions from me, actually, Jane. But yeah, I mean, I guess the topic is very difficult, but been really informative. And as you said, if anybody has any concerns, and if anyone is experiencing anything near to domestic abuse or violence, then please get in touch with us or, the police or whoever. So thanks, Jane. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, there's nothing more to be said from me either. So I think we'll wrap up for today. We will be back in a week's time with our next podcast, so listen out for that. We'll be carrying on with the theme. So it's goodbye from me.
Yeah, goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody. The links to those organisations we've mentioned will be given with the podcast. So see you next time.
Bye-bye, everybody.